You always felt like you were watching the world through glass. Everyone else seemed to be living inside the moment. You were somewhere slightly ahead of it, already finished with the thought everyone else had just begun. You thought that was normal. For a long time, you genuinely believed everyone's mind moved this way. Then you realized they didn't. And that realization changed everything. Most people assume high intelligence means a comfortable life, better decisions, fewer mistakes, easier relationships. But the people living inside that intelligence know the truth that never makes it into the conversation. The same mind that solves problems at a speed others can't follow is the same mind that cannot stop solving itself. At 2 a.m., during a quiet dinner, in the middle of a conversation you stopped being present in several sentences ago. That exhaustion is real, and it is lonely in a way that has no clean explanation. There is a particular kind of isolation that comes with thinking too fast. You are in a conversation, and you have already traced where it is going. You have considered 5 possible responses, dismissed 4 of them, and chosen the one least likely to make the other person feel left behind. So you slow yourself down. You perform presence. You nod at the right moments. But inside you have already moved on. This is not arrogance. It never was. It is a cognitive displacement that follows you everywhere. You exist slightly ahead of the moment everyone else is living in. And that gap, invisible from the outside, becomes the defining loneliness of your interior life. You can explain systems, patterns, and contradictions that most people never notice. But you cannot explain why you feel completely alone in a room full of people who care about you. And that contradiction is the one that stays. Here is something the conversation around intelligence almost never addresses. High IQ does not mean less emotion. It almost always means more. Psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski spent decades studying gifted individuals and found that exceptional intelligence consistently comes paired with what he called overexcitabilities. Heightened sensitivity to sensation, to emotion, to imagination, to the ethical weight of ordinary moments. Your mind does not just process faster, it feels deeper. It notices the subtle shift in someone's tone before their face changes. It catches the flicker of something unspoken in an otherwise normal exchange. It registers what was not said as clearly as what was. You catch everything, and catching everything has a price that compounds quietly over years. When someone dismisses you, it does not land lightly and pass. It stays, it echoes. You turn it over, you look for the root of it. You find every angle you could have handled it differently, and you hold those angles long after the moment has dissolved for everyone else involved. And beneath all that analysis is something more painful than the dismissal itself. The quiet question of whether you should have seen it coming, because you are supposed to see things coming. That is the rule you absorbed so early you no longer remember learning it. This story did not begin in adulthood. It began much earlier, in rooms where you were the child who finished first, who asked the question that made the teacher pause, who understood things at an age when understanding them was not entirely welcome. And with that early identification came a pressure so subtle it left no visible marks. You were praised for your mind, for being sharp, for getting it right. The adults in your life lit up when you performed intelligence. And children are exquisite readers of what makes the adults around them light up. So you learned without anyone saying it directly that your value lived in your mind. That being smart was not something you did. It was something you were, and something you had better keep being. Psychologists call this a fixed identity. When a child's intelligence becomes their entire self rather than one part of it, they build their entire sense of safety around maintaining that identity, which means that failure does not feel like a mistake to learn from. It feels like an erasure of who they are. So you became careful, meticulous. You stopped raising your hand unless you were certain. You rehearsed before you spoke. You learned to look composed even when the answer wasn't coming. You built a performance of capability so convincing that most people never notice the fear running underneath it. That fear has a name, imposter syndrome. But for gifted individuals, it is not simply doubting your accomplishments. It is a deeper, older fear that you have been fooling everyone, that the intelligence people see is something you have been producing rather than possessing, that one day the production will stall and they will all see what you have always suspected about yourself. But here's what that fear is actually evidence of. A mind honest enough to know how much it does not know. The most expansive thinkers in history were the ones most aware of the edges of their own understanding. That awareness is not weakness. It is the natural consequence of genuine depth. Relationships deserve their own conversation, because this is where the wound often runs the deepest and stays the longest. You learned early that your full self was a lot for people. Too many thoughts, too many questions. Connections made too quickly between ideas that seemed unrelated on the surface. Intensity that arrived before people were ready for it. So you adapted. You translated yourself. You edited your thoughts before they left your mouth. You learned to offer the simplified version of who you were because the complete version had a pattern of clearing rooms. And for a while this worked. You built friendships. You participated in conversations. You fit, more or less, into the shape of ordinary social life. But there was always something slightly hollow about it, because the person showing up in those connections was not entirely you. Real intimacy requires being fully seen. And you have spent most of your life showing people a carefully curated translation of yourself. Not because you are dishonest, but because the few times you allowed the full version to surface, the response taught you something you never fully recovered from. So the wall went up, quietly, gradually, behind a calm expression and a polished conversational style that no one could fault. And now you are lonely in a way that is hard to explain to people who have not lived it. Not alone in the room. Lonely inside the connection. Present in the conversation but absent from it. There but not reached. There is another experience that almost never gets named in conversations about intelligence. Existential boredom. Not the ordinary restlessness of an idle afternoon, something heavier. A chronic sense that the pace and depth of ordinary life is fundamentally mismatched with what your mind requires. You need novelty, complexity, problems with real weight to them, ideas that have not been fully resolved. When the environment does not provide that, your mind turns inward, and an inward-turning high IQ mind can be one of the most relentless places to live. Research consistently shows elevated rates of anxiety and depression in individuals with significantly above average intelligence. A mind running at full capacity with nowhere adequate to direct that capacity does not simply idle, it consumes itself. It generates worst-case scenarios with the same efficiency it would use to solve a genuine problem. It finds threats in ambiguity. It mistakes thorough preparation for control. It confuses the inability to predict an outcome with danger. The mind that was supposed to be your greatest advantage becomes your most intimate adversary, and you manage it alone, mostly, because explaining it to someone who does not experience it produces the particular helplessness of being looked at with sympathy and still not being understood. But I want to stop here, because something important needs to be said about all of this. Every pattern I have described was not a malfunction, it was a solution. It was the intelligent response of a mind doing exactly what minds are designed to do, finding ways to survive in an environment that was not built to hold what you were bringing to it. The perfectionism was not a character flaw, it was protection. If you could just be precise enough, prepared enough, excellent enough, the gap between what people expected and what you feared you were would never be exposed. The emotional distance was not coldness. It was conservation. You had been hurt by the particular pain of being genuinely seen and still not understood. Distance was the reasonable response to an unreasonable repetition. The overthinking was not weakness. It was vigilance. A mind trained by experience to believe that unexamined situations produce pain. You were building the only architecture available to you with the materials your early life provided. That was not failure. That was intelligence applied to survival. But here's the difficult truth that lives on the other side of that understanding. The architecture that kept you safe in childhood can become the structure that keeps you small in adulthood. The wall that protected the 8-year-old is the same wall that isolates the 30-year-old. The perfectionism that earned safety in school is the same perfectionism that tells you, in your own home, at the end of a day where you gave everything you had, that it still was not quite enough. Knowing this is not the same as fixing it. But knowing this is where real change becomes possible, because you cannot dismantle a wall you believe is still the only thing holding the ceiling up. So what does healing look like for a mind like yours? It does not look like thinking less. It does not look like becoming quieter, simpler, more easily satisfied. Those are not the directions your nature will allow, and they should not be. The goal is not to shrink the mind. The goal is to stop being imprisoned by it. It begins with separating your identity from your intelligence. You are not your IQ. You are not your performance. You are not the sum of problems you have solved or the reputation you have built around your capability. Those are things you do. They are not what you are. And when that separation becomes real, something shifts. Failure becomes information instead of identity collapse. Criticism becomes data instead of evidence of your deepest fear. Rest becomes necessary instead of something you have to justify. It continues with finding your people. Not many. You have never needed many, and you never will. But the few who do not require you to translate yourself, who find your questions worth sitting with, who meet your intensity without flinching and your silence without filling it with something smaller. Those people exist. I know the loneliness argues otherwise, but they exist. And it deepens with permission. Permission to not have the answer. Permission to be confused, uncertain, unresolved. Permission to be in the process of understanding rather than always already at the conclusion. The most honest thing a brilliant mind can do is admit what it does not yet know. That admission is not a crack in the foundation. That admission is the foundation. Your mind will never be quiet. It will always be turning something over, finding the seam in the smooth surface, following a thread past the point where others have stopped. That is not something to fix. That is something to finally stop apologizing for. The world needs people who cannot stop looking closely, who feel the weight of things other people set down without noticing, who ask the questions that take years to answer and keep asking them anyway. You were not given this mind to suffer with it in silence. You were given it to understand things others cannot reach, to feel what others move past too quickly to register, to hold complexity long enough for something true to emerge from it. That is not a small thing. That is not a burden. That is, if you can begin to believe it, exactly what you were meant to do. And the fact that it has been difficult, that the gift came wrapped in loneliness and pressure and a particular kind of exhaustion that has no simple name, does not mean you were given the wrong thing. It means you were given something real. And real things are always harder to carry than the ones that only look valuable from a distance. Keep carrying it. The world is different because you do.